Hey there, fellow literature explorers. Today, we turn our gaze toward Freelance, a 2023 action comedy that offers much more than narrative surface. It's a text rich with thematic complexity, symbolic resonance, and intricate character work that invites rigorous analysis. I'm delighted you've joined me, because in this video, we'll engage in a detailed examination of its cinematic language, narrative structure, and intertextual layers that shape its meaning. We'll begin by situating the film within its cultural and theoretical context, unpacking its stylistic choices and the director's auteur signature. Next, I'll provide a concise yet nuanced overview of the narrative arc, highlighting the story's core motifs without diluting its interpretive possibilities. From there, we'll delve into a compelling plot summary that foregrounds its narrative strategies and rhetorical devices, all framed to prepare you for the unfolding complexities. Crucially, we'll tease key thematic elements and pivotal narrative shifts, those moments that challenge conventional readings and open the text to multiple interpretations. Throughout, expect us to consider character dynamics, cinematic techniques like mise-en-scene and editing, and the film's engagement with broader discourses in film and literary theory. Prepare to engage with this film not just as viewers, but as scholars, questioning, interpreting, and appreciating the layers beneath its surface. So get comfortable, sharpen your critical lens, and let's embark on an intellectually rewarding exploration of this cinematic work. The opening movements of this tale unfold not in the chaos of explosions or the flash of gunfire, but in the silence of discontent. At the center is a man who has drifted from purpose, a former operative who once lived for the precision of missions, the clarity of danger, and the adrenaline of uncertainty. Now, however, he finds himself swallowed by the monotony of domesticity, a quiet suburban existence that feels more like exile than homecoming. The morning rituals, the empty chatter, the safe but numbing stability of civilian life create an almost suffocating rhythm, and behind his eyes is a restlessness that speaks louder than words. He is a soldier without a battlefield, a warrior without a war, and within that tension lies the first spark of the story's thematic heartbeat. The invitation to escape comes in the form of an unlikely assignment, mundane in appearance, yet simmering with potential danger beneath its polished surface. A corporate job, a contract framed as bodyguard work, seemingly removed from the explosive shadows of his past life. But the proposition carries a strange allure, not because of the paycheck, but because it whispers of something forgotten. The thrill of purpose, the raw pulse of responsibility, and the reminder that life can still demand more than passivity. The mission seems almost laughable at first, protecting a journalist during her interview with a notoriously unpredictable political figure. But this irony is the film's sly narrative trick, presenting danger through the facade of banality, drawing us in with the promise of a simple assignment before shattering the illusion. When the journey begins, it does not unfold on familiar ground. We are taken into a nation simmering with unrest, where the air itself feels unstable, thick with the tension of unspoken conflict. The lush landscapes, painted with almost idyllic beauty, mask the turbulence bubbling underneath. The journalist, ambitious and fearless, steps into the narrative not as a mere companion but as a mirror, reflecting the protagonist's own contradictions. Where he is weary and cynical, she is hungry for truth. Where he is guarded, she is boldly unafraid. Their pairing is not accidental but deliberate, contrasting worldviews woven into the narrative's structure, setting up a dialogue between safety and risk, truth and propaganda, survival and idealism. What begins as calculated formality unravels quickly. A staged interview, meant to offer control and political gloss, collapses into chaos when a coup erupts with violent immediacy. Soldiers flood the streets, allegiances splinter, and suddenly the thin veil of order shreds to reveal the raw face of anarchy. The mission, once framed as protection in controlled settings, morphs into survival against unpredictable forces. The hero and his charge are thrust into the wilderness, both literal and metaphorical, hunted not just by soldiers, but by the very instability of a nation at war with itself. Here the story shifts gears, tightening into a chase narrative, where every shadow might conceal an ambush and every ally could prove false. Amid the bullets and betrayals, the narrative anchors itself not in spectacle alone, but in the evolving dynamic between protector and protected. Their conversations, often crackling with tension or unexpected humor, strip away the stereotypes of bodyguard and client. Instead, the film pushes toward something deeper, an exploration of vulnerability and resilience. The journalist, initially framed as someone needing defense, reveals sharp intelligence and resourcefulness, challenging the protagonist's assumptions and peeling back his hardened cynicism. He, in turn, becomes more than a shield of muscle and reflex. he emerges as a fractured soul, navigating his own disillusionment, drawn unwillingly into rediscovering what it means to fight for something larger than himself. The tone of the narrative thrives on contradiction. It balances action with satire, violence with comedy, almost daring the viewer to laugh in moments where danger bristles closest. This tonal layering, while seemingly lighthearted, works as commentary, reminding us that absurdity often lurks within violence, and that the politics of power are as ridiculous as they are brutal. Gunfights are not just spectacles of choreography, but arenas of irony, where incompetence and chaos mock the seriousness of those grasping for control. The humor does not diminish the stakes. Instead, it heightens the surreal texture of a world where survival is entangled with farce. Yet beneath the humor lies the inevitability of choice. Our protagonist is pressed to confront what loyalty means, not only to those he protects, but to the fractured ideals he once believed in. The coup is not just background noise, it becomes the crucible where questions of morality, politics, and personal responsibility collide. Allegiances are tested, and trust becomes a commodity more dangerous than weapons. Every encounter along their journey, whether with mercenaries, opportunists, or unlikely allies, pushes them deeper into moral quicksand, where right and wrong dissolve into shades of gray. The excitement of the plot thrives on its unpredictability. Just when the narrative suggests escape, it ensnares them deeper. When safety appears within reach, betrayal twists the knife. One major shift occurs when the supposed puppet figure of political chaos reveals cunning beyond expectation, shattering the easy labels of villain and hero. Another arrives when the journalist's role expands beyond observation. Her choices begin to alter the trajectory of survival itself, placing her not as a passive participant, but as an active force shaping events. Moments of intimacy punctuate the chaos, brief interludes where the sound of gunfire fades and human truths slip through. In these spaces, laughter feels earned, sorrow feels honest, and survival becomes more than instinct, it becomes choice. The narrative flirts with romance, but not in a conventional sense. Instead, it frames connection as a rebellion against the dehumanization of violence, as if reaching for another person is itself an act of defiance in a collapsing world. As we move deeper into the unfolding story, the twists reveal themselves not simply as shock tactics, but as recalibrations of perspective. The real antagonist is not just the gunmen who chase them or the regime that betrays them, but the machinery of power itself, the systemic exploitation, the greed that fuels coups, and the cynical forces that reduce nations to battlegrounds for private interest. This recognition expands the narrative from a personal survival story into a critique, a mirror reflecting the absurdity and brutality of global politics. By the time the climax nears, the threads of comedy, chaos, and critique weave into a fever pitch. Choices made in desperation ripple outward, reshaping both character arcs and the very notion of what survival means. The final battles do not just test physical endurance but force reckonings with identity. Who these people are when stripped of illusion, and what remains when the masks of cynicism, ambition, and fear are torn away. The brilliance of the storytelling lies in how it teases without surrendering, promising resolution while leaving interpretive doors ajar. The audience is drawn to ask, was this simply a romp through absurdity, or a pointed allegory about the futility of imposed order? Did the protagonist reclaim purpose, or did he merely stumble into another performance of violence disguised as necessity? Are these survivors, or are they participants in a cycle too large to escape? Such questions hang in the air long after the screen fades, reminding us that this was never meant to be a straightforward tale of guns and glory. It is instead a layered text, a film that dances between satire and sincerity, chaos and order, purpose and futility. And in that space of contradiction, it demands more than passive watching. It demands that we wrestle with the implications, laugh at the absurdity, and wonder at the fragile, flawed humanity pulsing beneath the noise. The story begins in a space that feels almost too quiet, a suburban stillness broken only by the faint hum of routine. A man once built for action now finds himself trapped in repetition, days blending into one another with the muted tones of mediocrity. He was trained for precision, for danger, for missions that demanded quick instincts and sharper resolve. Yet here he sits, his life reduced to paperwork, errands, and small talk that echoes like background noise. The irony is that he has everything people around him might consider good, a stable home, safety, predictability, but for him, these comforts are prisons. The very absence of adrenaline has become its own kind of slow death, a suffocation of identity. When the call arrives, it does not thunder into his life with urgency. It tiptoes in, disguised as something laughably ordinary. A job, nothing more, nothing less. The offer seems absurd. Protect a journalist while she conducts an interview in a far-off country. Babysitting, really, at least on the surface. It is pitched as uneventful, but the name behind the interview, the president of a small, politically unstable nation, suggests otherwise. At first he scoffs. It seems beneath him, far from the type of calculated danger that once defined him. Yet the more he resists, the more he feels the weight of his own inertia pressing down, reminding him that the life he leads now offers nothing but staleness. Accepting the assignment isn't about money, not really. It's about remembering who he once was, testing whether he still carries the sharpness he once lived by, or if he has finally dulled into irrelevance. The journalist herself is a spark, different from what he expects. Fierce, restless, and unyielding, she's driven not by thrill but by truth, and truth, especially in lands where power trembles, can be the most dangerous mission of all. Their first meeting bristles with contrast. He carries himself like a man weighed down by cynicism, eyes scanning rooms before he speaks, every gesture guarded. She is blunt, dismissive of his protection at first, insisting she is capable of managing herself. Their dialogue crackles with unspoken tension, the kind born not of romance, but of two people living in opposite directions. He sees a world where trust is always a liability. She sees one where risk is the cost of uncovering reality. Neither bends, but both are intrigued, forced into an uneasy partnership. Arrival in the foreign nation carries with it a sense of foreboding. The landscapes are lush, painted with a vibrancy that hides the fractures within. Billboards celebrate the president as a visionary leader, while whispers in back alleys tell another story of corruption, resistance, and a country teetering on the brink. As they drive through crowded streets, his instincts sharpen. Every corner feels like an ambush waiting to bloom. Soldiers stand at checkpoints with rigid stares, children dart through traffic with practiced recklessness, and amidst it all, the journalist is already scribbling notes, already piecing together the puzzle of a regime whose image doesn't match its reality. The interview is staged in an opulent compound, a palace of grandeur meant to project power. Marble floors gleam, chandeliers hang like trophies, and yet beneath the gloss lies an air of paranoia. Guards hover too closely, cameras linger too long, and the president himself radiates the unease of a man accustomed to controlling every narrative. The conversation that unfolds between journalist and leader is sharp-edged, both sides feigning civility while probing at cracks. She questions, he deflects, she insists, he spins. Every word becomes a duel. For the bodyguard, the room feels combustible. His eyes never stop moving, watching the twitch of a guard's hand, the shifting stance of soldiers outside. He can feel it even before it erupts, the tension stretched so thin that it can only snap. And then it does. A coup bursts into motion with terrifying speed. Gunfire rattles the walls, guards scatter, and the illusion of order dissolves into chaos. The journalist is wrenched from her seat. The president disappears behind a curtain of armed men, and suddenly the bodyguard's role shifts from passive overseer to active protector. He doesn't think, he moves, shielding, dodging, ushering her into hallways that twist like mazes. Explosions echo in the distance, closer with each second, the once pristine palace now a battlefield of broken glass and echoing screams. Their escape thrusts them into streets drenched in panic. Civilians scatter, soldiers clash, and the city transforms into a war zone before their eyes. What was once merely tense has now descended into open warfare. He grips her hand, not as an act of intimacy but as a survival tether, dragging her through alleys, over fences, into the uncharted wilderness where even his training cannot predict every threat. She, though terrified, refuses silence. Questions spill from her lips, desperate for understanding, but he is consumed only with the task of staying ahead of the chaos, every sense alive, every instinct clawing for dominance. The wilderness swallows them quickly. Dense jungle presses in, the air humid and heavy, sounds of pursuit lingering just behind. Soldiers are not their only enemies, the land itself is unforgiving. Swamps threaten to trap their footing, rivers demand perilous crossings, and the wildlife that lurks in shadows is as ruthless as any mercenary. Yet within this unforgiving terrain, something shifts. Their dialogue begins to change. No longer is it merely her challenging him or him dismissing her. Shared fear carves out a fragile bond. In whispered conversations by small, hidden fires, fragments of their pasts bleed through. She speaks of her relentless search for truth, of stories buried and silenced by power. He reluctantly admits to his disillusionment, of missions that blurred morality until all that remained was exhaustion. The chase never lets up. Helicopters skim treetops, searchlights probing through canopies, forcing them deeper into treacherous landscapes. At one point they stumble upon villagers who offer food and shelter, but trust is dangerous currency. Are these allies or informants? The bodyguard's suspicion wrestles with her optimism. their argument almost breaking the fragile partnership they've built. But survival does not allow for division. When soldiers descend upon the village in the dead of night, both protector and journalist find themselves forced to fight together, relying on instinct and wit, escaping once more into darkness that feels eternal. Key developments strike like pulses of lightning. The coup reveals itself not as a mere grab for power, but as a carefully orchestrated play, threads of corruption stretching farther than either expected. The president, far from being simply overthrown, is caught in a web of betrayal from his own circle. Loyalties fracture. Allies reveal themselves as enemies. Every step the fugitives take is shadowed by betrayal, and each time they think they've found safety, the rug is yanked from beneath them. Amidst the turbulence, the journalist herself begins to evolve. No longer content to simply document, she adapts, learning survival from her unlikely partner, wielding resourcefulness in ways that surprise even him. She transforms from burden to asset, her intellect matched with growing grit. For the former soldier, this shift is quietly disarming. He had expected to protect her, to shield her from the storm. Instead, he finds himself leaning on her resolve, her determination reminding him of the very drive he thought he had lost. The first act of their odyssey culminates in a shocking revelation. What they thought was a random collapse of power reveals itself as a performance, an orchestrated act meant to manipulate global attention. Their pursuers are not merely soldiers fighting for control. They are mercenaries with shifting allegiances, pawns in a game designed not for liberation, but for control of resources and influence. The journalist, piecing together the fragments, realizes she holds not just a story but a weapon. Her knowledge of the truth makes her more dangerous than any gun, and it is that truth which now makes them both targets. In this realization, the story pivots into deeper tension. Their survival is no longer about evading soldiers. It is about outrunning a system designed to silence them. Their partnership, once reluctant, is now bound by necessity and sharpened by trust forged in fire. He no longer sees her as merely a charge to protect, and she no longer sees him as simply a cynical guardian. Together they are caught in a storm larger than themselves, but their bond becomes their only constant, a fragile lifeline in a world collapsing around them. The jungle becomes both sanctuary and prison, a labyrinth that mirrors their predicament. Every sound could be salvation or death, every choice a gamble with no guarantees. Yet within the relentless chase, humor creeps in, moments of absurdity that underline the surrealness of their plight. A misplaced step leading to a slapstick tumble, an ill-timed quip during gunfire, laughter bubbling up not from joy but from exhaustion. The tonal contradictions remind us of the razor-thin line between comedy and tragedy, chaos and absurdity, humanity and despair. And as the first movement of their journey nears its point of fracture, they find themselves not simply running but questioning. What is the price of survival when truth itself becomes a target? What does it mean to protect someone whose power lies not in weapons but in words? The soldier who once believed his life was over begins to feel the faint stirrings of purpose again, though he cannot yet name it. The journalist who thought she sought only a story now realizes she is entangled in a narrative larger than herself, one where her choices could shift the fate of a nation. The ground beneath them is unsteady, both literally and figuratively. Alliances shift like shadows, threats loom closer with each passing day, and in the distance, the storm of betrayal grows louder. The first act of their ordeal closes not with triumph but with uncertainty, their path forward as treacherous as the jungle they traverse. But within that uncertainty lies the heartbeat of their journey. Survival not as instinct alone, but as defiance, as a reclamation of identity, as the fragile beginning of something far more dangerous than either expected, truth in the face of corruption, and humanity in the grip of chaos. The jungle holds them in its grip as if testing their will to survive. Days blur into nights filled with restless silence, their only soundtrack the steady rhythm of insects, distant gunfire, and the heavy breath of exhaustion. The soldier moves like a man who has walked this path before, eyes sharp, ears attuned to the faintest shifts in the air, yet even he cannot mask the growing weight of pursuit. The journalist, once the burden he thought he was saddled with, is no longer simply trailing behind. She keeps pace, questions lingering in her mind but tempered now by instinct. What was once irritation between them has transformed into an unspoken language, a fragile thread of trust woven by necessity. The deeper they travel, the more fractured the world around them becomes. Villages they pass through bear scars of violence, walls pockmarked by bullets, doors splintered by forced entry, families displaced and terrified. Every face they meet tells a story of survival, yet every extended hand could also belong to an informant. In one such settlement, they come across a teacher who shelters them for a night, speaking in hushed tones about the truth of the coup. It wasn't simply chaos. It was a long-orchestrated scheme, with generals and mercenaries funded by forces far beyond the country's borders. The journalist listens intently, piecing together the fragments with growing urgency. Each revelation paints a clearer picture. The president was never the real target. He was a figurehead, disposable, replaced by those hungrier for power. And those chasing them now don't just want them silenced. They want the narrative rewritten entirely. The soldier knows too well what happens to pawns caught between titans. His cynicism tells him to run, to stay alive and leave the bigger game to the players. But something gnaws at him, something the journalist's stubborn resolve has begun to awaken. She is relentless, refusing to see their ordeal as mere survival. To her, every detail is evidence, every betrayal a piece of a story that could topple lies. For the first time in years, he begins to wonder if fighting has meaning beyond endurance. Their journey twists again when they are captured, not by the coup's forces, but by loyalists still clinging to the ousted president. Hauled before him in a hidden encampment, they find a man stripped of grandeur, his once booming rhetoric replaced by quiet desperation. He pleads not for his people, but for his own relevance, begging the journalist to tell his version of events. The soldier sees through it immediately. This man is no savior, only another participant in the endless cycle of power. The journalist, however, recognizes the value in his words. Even lies can illuminate truth when framed against contradictions. Their escape from the encampment is not violent but calculated, a manipulation of opportunity, a quiet slipping into the night. But as they vanish into the darkness, the journalist carries something far more dangerous than before, the story itself, sharpened into a blade that could cut at the core of the coup's illusions. The chase escalates. Mercenaries double their hunt, and the landscape itself turns hostile. They cross rivers that roar with deadly currents, climb mountains that strip their strength, and wade through marshes that swallow every step. Yet even in exhaustion, moments of absurdity surface, an argument about directions while bullets snap past them, a sarcastic quip that breaks tension during a gunfight, laughter bubbling out not because the moment is funny, but because it is unbearable. These contradictions shape the tone, underscoring how survival in chaos often feels more surreal than cinematic. It is during one desperate night, hiding in the ruins of an old mission house, that the soldier finally reveals his truth. The missions of his past, the violence he carried out in the name of order, were not heroic tales. They were compromises, each choice blurring morality until he no longer recognized himself. He admits he left not because he wanted peace, but because he was hollow, burned out by the realization that his battles changed nothing. The journalist listens without interruption, her silence speaking louder than any platitudes. When she finally responds, it is not to comfort but to challenge. Maybe it doesn't matter what you did then. Maybe what matters is what you choose now. For him, those words strike like a spark in dry tinder. The true twist arrives when they finally corner information that flips the entire narrative. The coup wasn't solely about power within the nation. It was orchestrated by external forces with vested interests. Corporations seeking resources, politicians seeking leverage, arms dealers fueling both sides. The chaos is not random, it is manufactured. The mercenaries aren't patriots or rebels. They're contractors loyal only to the highest bidder. And the journalist, with her notes, recordings, and relentless eye for contradiction, now holds the one thing they fear most, exposure. Their path converges on the capital once more, drawn back not by choice but by inevitability. The climax builds as they navigate streets teeming with soldiers and civilians caught in the crossfire. Safe houses collapse into betrayals, allies turn to enemies, and the circle tightens until the only option left is confrontation. The journalist insists on transmitting her story, getting the truth out no matter the cost. The soldier knows that doing so will paint a target so bright on their backs that survival becomes almost impossible. Yet he also knows that to run now would be to prove every cynical belief he has clung to, that nothing matters, that survival is the only point. And for the first time in years, he doesn't want to believe that anymore. Their plan is desperate. Using the chaos of the capital as cover, they infiltrate a communications hub, fighting through waves of mercenaries who know what is at stake. The choreography of violence is sharp, brutal, and laced with the dark humor that has punctuated their journey. A misplaced grenade sets off a chain reaction of absurdity, even as blood spills, reminding us again of the surreal comedy that shadows tragedy. In the heart of this storm, the journalist broadcasts the truth, sending her words like weapons across the airwaves. The coup's narrative fractures instantly, the manufactured lies unraveling under the weight of exposure. But victory does not come clean. The soldier is wounded, collapsing in the aftermath of battle, his body finally surrendering to the relentless toll. The journalist refuses to leave him, dragging him through corridors as explosions ripple in the distance. Their escape is not triumphant but ragged, every step a battle against exhaustion and inevitability. They stumble into the night, smoke choking the skyline, the sound of riots echoing through the city as truth sparks rebellion. The resolution comes quietly. In the aftermath, the world does not magically transform. Corruption does not vanish, power does not crumble overnight, and the scars of violence remain. But the journalist's story spreads, igniting questions that can no longer be silenced. For her, the fight is just beginning. For him, the journey has already transformed him. No longer hollow, no longer resigned, he feels the faint pulse of purpose stirring once again. Their paths may diverge, but what binds them is not romance or survival alone. It is the recognition that in a world built on deception, truth itself is rebellion. The story closes on an image not of grandeur, but of quiet resilience. A soldier scarred but breathing, a journalist bruised but unyielding, walking into uncertainty with the knowledge that their ordeal was not meaningless. The comedy, the chaos, the betrayal, and the bloodshed, all of it has crystallized into something sharper, something worth remembering. Not a tale of victory in the traditional sense, but of defiance, of laughter in the face of absurdity, of humanity clinging stubbornly to itself in a world determined to strip it away. In the end, what resonates is not the explosions or the spectacle, but the fragile, imperfect bond between two people who refuse to surrender to emptiness. A soldier who rediscovers the possibility of meaning, and a journalist who proves that truth, though dangerous, can cut deeper than any weapon. Their story lingers like smoke after fire, an echo of survival, a reminder that even in chaos, there is space for resilience, for rebellion, and for the stubborn insistence that humanity endures. At the core of this story lies a man whose very presence feels like a contradiction. Once, he was a blade sharpened for war, disciplined, precise, and certain of his place in the machinery of violence. Yet when we first meet him, he is dulled by the weight of peace, suffocated by routine that offers comfort without meaning. He is a soldier without a battlefield, a warrior stripped of purpose, forced into the liminal space between who he was and who he no longer knows how to be. His movements are deliberate but heavy, his gaze sharp but tired, as if every glance into the mirror reminds him that time is erasing the very identity he once carried with pride. This disillusionment is not simply the boredom of a man missing action. It is the existential emptiness of one who has lived too long in extremity and cannot reconcile with the ordinary. The suburbs do not cradle him, they mock him, whispering that he is no longer necessary, no longer capable. Beneath his silence lingers an anger that is not directed outward but inward, a gnawing dissatisfaction that he cannot articulate. When the assignment to protect a journalist falls into his lap, it is not adventure that calls to him, but the chance to test whether he still matters. He accepts not for money or glory, but for the selfish, desperate need to feel alive again. Once the chaos begins, the layers of his character peel back with startling speed. In the jungle, in firefights, in the madness of a coup unraveling, he becomes the man he once was, reflexive, sharp, unflinching. Yet something has shifted. For once his missions were carried out with blind adherence, now he is conscious of the absurdity around him. He sees the incompetence of mercenaries, the ridiculousness of political puppetry, and his cynicism becomes a kind of armor. He mocks the chaos even as he fights through it, a man who has seen too much to take violence at face value anymore. And yet, in that humor, in that biting wit, we glimpse his greatest wound. He has lost faith in the very structures he once served. The soldier is not a broken man, but he is hollow, fighting because he knows nothing else, surviving because survival is the only skill he still trusts. The journalist stands as his perfect foil. Where he has grown weary, she thrives on momentum. Where he is cynical, she is driven by belief. At first, she appears reckless, a truth-seeker throwing herself into dangerous waters with naive bravery. But as the story unfolds, she is revealed as something much more complex. Her hunger for truth is not a childish fantasy, but a deliberate rebellion against silence. She knows the risks, knows the consequences, but her pursuit of honesty is a calling she cannot abandon. She sees stories not as words but as weapons, the kind that can cut through propaganda and topple illusions. Her strength does not come from physical prowess but from conviction, and that makes her as dangerous as any soldier with a gun. Their relationship begins with friction, almost antagonistic. He sees her as a liability, someone to protect but also someone whose idealism is laughable in a world run by greed. She sees him as a relic, hardened but blind, trapped in his bitterness. But the crucible of survival burns away their misjudgments. As they stumble through firefights and betrayals, they learn to recognize one another not as stereotypes, but as fractured humans carrying different burdens. She reveals her resourcefulness, her ability to adapt, her refusal to crumble even when terror claws at her throat. He, in turn, reveals not just his skill but his humanity, the cracks in his armor, the quiet sorrow that lingers beneath his cynicism. What emerges is not romance in the traditional sense, but a bond rooted in recognition, an acknowledgement that they complete in each other what each lacks. The president, though less central, plays a pivotal symbolic role in the story. He is a man built on image, draped in grandeur that masks fragility. His palace, his speeches, his posturing, all crafted to project control, yet when the coup erupts, his mask slips. Beneath the veneer of power lies desperation, a man clinging not to ideals but to relevance. His fall from grace is not tragic but inevitable, for he is not a leader but a performer in a stage play written by greed. His character embodies the hollow spectacle of politics, the illusion of authority hiding corruption and fear. He is a warning of what happens when leadership becomes theater, when power is stripped of principle. The mercenaries, shifting and unreliable, form another layer of character dynamics. They are not villains in the traditional sense, driven by ideology or personal vendetta. They are opportunists, shaped by money and contracts, their loyalty for sale to the highest bidder. Their presence underscores the larger theme of the narrative, that violence is rarely about noble causes and often about profit. They mock the notion of patriotism, exposing war as a marketplace where lives are currency. For the soldier, their existence is a bitter reminder of what he once was, a tool wielded by others, used for ends he did not question. For the journalist, they represent the very corruption she seeks to expose, the faceless machinery that thrives in shadows. Yet the most compelling characters are not those defined by roles of power, but the ones they encounter in fleeting moments, the villagers offering shelter, the teacher who whispers truth, the children darting through ruined streets. These figures, brief though they are, embody resilience. They remind us that within the madness of coups and mercenaries and political theater, ordinary people carry the heaviest weight. Their faces linger, not because of screen time, but because of what they symbolize, the cost of survival for those who cannot run, the silent casualties of games played by men in suits and soldiers in uniforms. The evolution of the soldier is perhaps the most poignant arc in the story. He begins as a man hollowed by disillusionment, surviving on instinct alone. Through his bond with the journalist, he confronts not just external enemies but the emptiness within himself. He learns reluctantly that survival without meaning is no survival at all. His humor, once a weapon of detachment, transforms into a tool of connection. His cynicism softens, not into naivete, but into acceptance that meaning is not handed down by systems of power. It is carved out in small acts of defiance, in the choice to protect, to believe, to care. By the end, he is not redeemed in the heroic sense, but reborn in a quieter one. He finds purpose not in grand battles, but in the fragile bond he has forged, in the simple recognition that life is more than endurance. The journalist's arc is equally transformative. She begins as a truth seeker willing to risk everything, but perhaps underestimating the cost. Through fire and blood, she learns that truth is not an abstract concept but a living thing, one that demands sacrifice. She is not hardened into cynicism like her companion, but she matures into a deeper understanding of what her pursuit entails. By the end, she is no longer just documenting the story. She is the story, her survival and her words intertwined as testimony. She emerges not as a victim who needed protection, but as a force that changes the course of events. Her strength does not erase her fear. It coexists with it, making her courage more resonant. Together, their arcs intertwine like threads woven into the same tapestry. He discovers meaning through her belief, and she realizes the weight of her mission through his protection. Their bond does not resolve into a tidy romance but into something rarer, mutual recognition of each other's humanity. In a world that seeks to strip them of individuality, reducing him to a weapon, reducing her to a voice, they reclaim themselves by refusing to surrender to emptiness. What lingers about these characters is not their victories but their flaws. The soldier's weariness, the journalist's stubbornness, the president's desperation, the mercenary's greed, each reflects a facet of the human condition. They remind us that stories of survival are not about perfection, but about persistence. These characters are not archetypes, but contradictions, messy and imperfect, caught between fear and courage, selfishness and sacrifice. And it is in those contradictions that the story finds its deepest resonance. A soldier rediscovering purpose, not in glory, but in survival. A journalist proving that truth is not fragile, but unbreakable. A fallen president exposing the futility of empty power. Mercenaries revealing the machinery behind violence. and the silent masses, their lives shaping the backdrop, embodying resilience in the face of chaos. The brilliance of these character portraits lies in their refusal to offer easy answers. They are not simply good or bad, heroic or villainous. They are human, fractured, stubborn, frightened, and defiant. And it is in their humanity that the story pulses most fiercely, a reminder that beneath the spectacle of coups and firefights lies the quieter, more enduring struggle, the fight to remain human in a world that profits from forgetting what humanity means. When stories about films circulate, they often focus on the glamour, the red carpet moments, the glossy trailers, the carefully marketed allure of spectacle. Yet what lingers beneath the surface of every production is a world far stranger, a place where accidents, improvisations, cultural clashes, and sheer coincidence shape the very fabric of what we see on screen. This particular film carries with it a vault of peculiar tales, fragments of production that seem almost as chaotic, absurd, and layered as the narrative itself. To peel back that curtain is to enter a realm where fact often feels like fiction, and where the strangest moments become the hidden pulse that drives the story we eventually experience. The first oddity rests not in the jungles where much of the story unfolds, but in the decision-making rooms where it was greenlit. What began as a straightforward pitch, an action comedy with shades of political satire, grew into something far less conventional the more the creative team debated it. The director, known more for straightforward, muscular action fare, found himself fascinated with the idea of weaving humor into chaos, of treating violence not as a solemn battlefield, but as an arena for absurdity. This tension shaped everything that followed. From the earliest days, there were arguments about tone. Should it be deadly serious or slyly comic? In the end, the production chose both, and this unusual fusion created headaches for financiers who couldn't quite categorize what they were paying for. It is said that one producer joked the film should be marketed as a satire wearing the costume of an action movie, a line that stuck among the crew, whispered whenever the script felt too strange to pin down. When the cameras finally rolled, strangeness followed in unexpected ways. Much of the movie was filmed in the Dominican Republic, a location chosen for its dense jungles and flexible infrastructure. Yet the environment resisted control at every turn. One particularly bizarre day involved a scene with a helicopter. The machine, brought in to stage a tense pursuit, refused to cooperate with the director's vision. The pilot, a veteran of both military and commercial flying, insisted that the stunts demanded by the script were impractical, if not suicidal. Arguments escalated until the director finally relented, forcing the sequence to be restructured. But here lies the strangeness. The rewrites ended up producing a sequence funnier and more absurd than originally planned, with the helicopter almost comically failing to find its targets, weaving through the sky like a confused predator. What had begun as a battle of wills between director and pilot transformed into one of the film's most memorable action comedy hybrids, born entirely out of real-world resistance. Animals, too, became unexpected participants in the film's making. Shooting in wild terrain meant constant interruptions from the environment. There were stories of entire takes ruined by sudden flocks of birds screeching into frame, monkeys snatching food from crew tables, and even one incident where a snake slithered directly into an actor's boot between takes. The actor in question screamed so loudly that sound engineers thought an explosion had gone off in the distance. What might have been a disaster turned into laughter, with the cast retelling the snake story over drinks for weeks. Oddly enough, the director leaned into these interruptions, allowing the chaos of the natural world to seep into the texture of the scenes. The jungle wasn't just a backdrop. It became a character itself, unpredictable and mocking, much like the narrative it housed. Perhaps the most surreal fact involves the film's humor itself. Many of the funniest lines were not in the script but born on set, whispered in the heat of exhaustion, muttered between takes, or tossed out when chaos disrupted the carefully rehearsed beats. The lead actor, carrying decades of experience in action roles, found himself encouraged to improvise, something he wasn't particularly known for. And yet, it was in those unscripted moments that the character gained his world-weary wit. A joke about how bullets seemed to have the worst aim in history came straight from his lips during a particularly messy shootout scene where blanks kept misfiring. The director, instead of cutting, kept it in. By the end of production, an estimated third of the film's comedy was unscripted, stitched together from spur-of-the-moment absurdity. Another curious detail rests with the journalist's portrayal. The actress, eager to embody the role of someone both fearless and flawed, reportedly shadowed a group of real reporters in volatile environments before filming began. She wanted to understand not just their courage but their rituals, the little ways they prepared themselves to walk into danger. From this research, she incorporated habits that never appeared in the script, but added layers of realism. The way she double-checked her recorder even when it wasn't running, the nervous tapping of her pen against her notebook, the slight pause before asking a loaded question. Audiences may not have noticed consciously, but these touches gave the character an authenticity that was rooted in lived truth rather than cinematic artifice. And then there were the accidents that became legends. One of the strangest involved a staged explosion meant to shatter a Jeep during a chase. The special effects team meticulously calculated the blast, but on the day of filming, the timing went awry. The Jeep refused to flip as planned, stubbornly remaining upright despite the force of the explosion. Rather than cut, the director kept rolling as the cast scrambled to improvise around the failed stunt. In editing, the sequence became comedic gold, the Jeep stubbornly smoking, but refusing to topple, a bizarre metaphor for the absurd resilience of everything in this chaotic world. Audiences later assumed the gag was intentional, a clever joke about action movie cliches, when in reality it was the sheer refusal of physics to cooperate that created the moment. The film's soundtrack, too, carries its own peculiar backstory. Instead of leaning entirely on traditional action beats, the composer experimented with tonal contradictions. He incorporated upbeat rhythms into violent sequences, creating an almost satirical dissonance. One chase scene was scored with music that sounded closer to a carnival march than a thriller. The idea was risky, nearly cut during test screenings, but it stayed, cementing the film's tonal duality. What most don't realize, however, is that much of this experimentation came from budgetary constraints. The production couldn't afford the bombastic orchestral scoring originally envisioned, forcing the composer to turn toward more eclectic, inexpensive instrumentation. What emerged was a soundscape unlike anything else in mainstream action cinema, a product not of grand vision, but of necessity. One of the quirks whispered about most among the crew was the relationship between the two leads off camera. Their chemistry on screen, born of friction that evolves into reluctant trust, was mirrored behind the scenes in stranger ways. They clashed during rehearsals, often arguing about how much humor versus seriousness should color their interactions. Yet those arguments fueled the very energy the camera captured. At one point, the actress teased that her co-star was allergic to laughing, and challenged him to break character during filming by slipping unexpected lines into her dialogue. She succeeded more than once, leaving moments of genuine laughter etched into the final cut. Their playful antagonism became a thread woven through production, blurring the lines between performance and reality. The editing process uncovered its own oddities. Test audiences in early screenings responded not to the moments the studio expected, but to the strangest beats. A scene where the protagonist, out of sheer frustration, hurls a useless radio into the jungle received louder applause than some of the most expensive set pieces. Viewers latched onto the absurdity, finding in it the heart of the film's tone. Editors were forced to restructure the pacing, giving more weight to the accidental comedy than to the spectacle, a reversal that baffled financiers but ultimately defined the film's rhythm. Another peculiar fact lies in the choice of props. The production, constrained by logistical challenges, often used real-world objects in ways they weren't intended. At one point, a military-grade vehicle was actually a refurbished tourist bus disguised with armor plating and paint. In another scene, weapons were cobbled together from local markets when shipments of prop guns were delayed. One infamous day saw an actor wielding what was essentially a repurposed nail gun painted black, something eagle-eyed fans would later catch, sparking debates online about whether it was a deliberate joke or a continuity error. In truth, it was neither. It was simply the crew improvising to keep shooting alive. But perhaps the strangest of all the stories comes from the final days of production. Rumors persist that the director, unsatisfied with the planned ending, rewrote the climax on set with only hours to spare before filming. The script supervisor reportedly scrambled to keep track of the sudden changes, while the actors were forced to memorize entirely new dialogue minutes before rolling. Chaos reigned, yet what emerged was a climax filled with raw unpredictability, a sequence that carried the rough edges of spontaneity. For audiences, this gave the ending a frantic authenticity, a sense that anything could happen. For the crew, it was a nightmare of improvisation, stitched together from sleepless nights and last-minute rewrites. The strangeness of this film's creation lies in its constant collision between intention and accident. The jungle refused to obey, helicopters wouldn't fly the way they were meant to, explosions fizzled instead of roared, props went missing, animals stole the spotlight, actors bickered and then laughed. And yet from this chaos, a peculiar kind of harmony emerged. The very unpredictability that threatened to unravel the production instead infused it with the same energy that pulses through the narrative itself, a world where order collapses into absurdity, and where survival means learning to laugh in the middle of danger. What makes these behind-the-scenes tales so fascinating is not merely their humor or peculiarity, but the way they mirror the story on screen. Just as the characters stumble through a coup that spirals into absurdity, the cast and crew stumbled through a production equally riddled with unpredictability. Truth and fiction collapse into one another, leaving us with a final product that feels both meticulously crafted and wildly improvised. It is in these oddities, the snake in the boot, the Jeep that wouldn't flip, the jokes born from exhaustion, that the soul of the film was truly forged. The strangest facts, then, are not isolated anecdotes but threads in a larger pattern. They remind us that filmmaking, for all its polish, is an act of chaos wrangled into coherence. And sometimes, as in this case, it is the chaos that gives the story its beating heart. Without the failed explosions, the stubborn helicopters, the unscripted laughter, and the jungle's constant rebellion, the film would have been something else entirely, perhaps smoother, perhaps more conventional, but certainly less alive. What we see on screen is not just the product of design, but of accidents, of absurdities, of the strange dance between intention and reality. And in that dance lies the true magic of cinema. The story unfolds like a tightly wound spring, snapping open with an energy that refuses to relent. From its earliest moments, the film insists that the world we are entering is not merely about bullets and explosions, but about the weight of choices, the fragility of truth, and the absurdity of power. To look at it critically is to see how each event, each shift in tension, is not just spectacle but a deliberate commentary on the human condition, couched in the language of action, comedy, and satire. The earliest critical event lies in the quiet introduction of the protagonist, a man adrift in domestic monotony. On the surface, these moments may seem unremarkable. The bland house, the repetitive routines, the restlessness masked by silence. Yet from a critical perspective, this sequence sets the stage for everything to follow. It reminds us that emptiness itself can be an antagonist, that a life stripped of purpose can weigh heavier than the chaos of violence. Thematically, it frames the story as not just a physical journey, but a psychological one, an exploration of what happens when someone built for extremes is denied meaning. Audiences responded to this opening with divided perspectives. Some saw it as slow, even indulgent, but others recognized its importance, praising the way it grounded the characters' later choices in a foundation of existential despair. When the assignment emerges, to guard a journalist during her interview with a foreign leader, it carries an almost comedic banality, and yet, from a critical lens, this is a vital event. It highlights the absurdity of the structures of power. A soldier once tasked with protecting nations is now reduced to escort duty. A journalist chasing truth is reduced to navigating carefully staged political theater. This moment speaks to the devaluation of expertise and conviction in a world governed by appearances and spin. What seems like a small, almost irrelevant mission becomes the crucible in which themes of disillusionment and truth will be tested. The interview scene itself is perhaps the first major event where the story's thematic undercurrents crystallize. Critics have noted how its staging mirrors classical drama, a room dripping with wealth and control, a leader perched as if on a throne, a journalist pushing against walls of deflection. The protagonist lingers in the margins, watching, listening, every muscle taut with suspicion. The dialogue crackles not just with words but with subtext, the clash between truth and propaganda, between power and accountability. The eruption of the coup at this moment is not mere coincidence but deliberate symbolism. The fragile illusion of order cannot withstand scrutiny. Once questioned, it crumbles into chaos. Scholars analyzing the film's structure often point to this as the true beginning of the story, where the narrative's skin peels back to reveal the rot beneath. The chaos that follows, the coup tearing through the palace, the sudden collapse of safety into survival, has been widely discussed as both thrilling and satirical. Action critics praised the choreography of destruction, the way gunfire and explosions were woven into claustrophobic tension. Yet cultural critics saw more: the absurd speed with which order collapses, the ridiculousness of soldiers fumbling over control, the way the palace itself becomes a metaphor for the fragility of political theater. This duality, critics argue, is the film's unique voice. It refuses to let audiences simply enjoy violence, forcing them to laugh at its absurdity, even as they gasp at its intensity. As the protagonists flee into the wilderness, the film shifts in tone, and this event, the sudden transition from urban coup to jungle chase, marks another critical turning point. For some viewers it felt disjointed, a leap from political satire to survival thriller. Yet deeper analysis suggests that this shift is intentional. The jungle becomes the embodiment of chaos, a physical manifestation of the lawlessness they are now trapped within. Where the city represented the illusion of structure, the jungle represents pure unpredictability. Critics of post-colonial cinema noted how the landscape itself was not neutral, but charged, evoking centuries of imperial interference in fragile nations. The protagonist's struggle through this terrain was read as not just survival, but a confrontation with forces larger than themselves, forces that cannot be neatly categorized as friend or enemy. The encounters with villagers, teachers, and ordinary civilians along the way are often overlooked by casual viewers, but stand as some of the film's most significant moments when examined critically. These fleeting figures represent the human cost of political games, the silent casualties who live and die in the margins of power struggles. The choice to include them, however briefly, grounds the film in a moral reality that transcends its comedic absurdity. Critics sympathetic to this perspective hailed these moments as vital reminders of stakes, while others argued they were underdeveloped, serving more as symbolic devices than as fully realized characters. Yet it is precisely their fleetingness that makes them haunting. They linger as echoes, reminders of lives caught in cycles they cannot control. Perhaps the most revealing event in terms of character comes when the protagonists confront the ousted president in hiding. His desperate attempt to rewrite the narrative, to beg for relevance, is more than plot progression. It is a scathing critique of leadership without integrity. Here, the film lays bare its satirical heart. Leaders are shown not as saviors, but as performers in endless theater, clinging to image while truth crumbles around them. Audiences found this moment unsettling, even uncomfortable, as the humor collided with the stark reality of corruption. Scholars of political cinema highlighted this scene as one of the clearest indictments of contemporary power, arguing that it transforms the story from personal survival into political allegory. The capture and escape sequences that follow serve not merely as thrills, but as commentaries on loyalty and betrayal. Time and again, supposed allies reveal themselves as opportunists, and trust becomes a dangerous gamble. From a critical perspective, these betrayals underscore one of the film's central themes, that in systems built on greed and corruption, loyalty is impossible. Critics compared this motif to classical noir, where characters navigate worlds where morality is absent and survival hinges on constant suspicion. The soldier's cynicism, once seen as weary bitterness, begins to appear prophetic. The unraveling of the conspiracy, that the coup is not about patriotism but profit, orchestrated by external corporations and political interests, stands as perhaps the film's most significant thematic revelation. For some viewers, this twist felt predictable, echoing countless thrillers, where shadowy forces manipulate events from afar. Yet for critics, the importance was not in originality, but in tone. The revelation is delivered not with solemn gravity, but with biting absurdity, almost mocking the very predictability of such corruption. This tonal choice transforms the cliché into commentary. It is not just that power is corrupt, but that corruption itself has become banal, laughably obvious, and yet devastatingly effective. The climactic infiltration of the communications hub is another event layered with meaning. On one hand, it is the thrilling action centerpiece, the culmination of chase, fight, and desperation. On the other, it is a symbolic battle for narrative itself. The journalist's fight to broadcast the truth is framed as more dangerous than any physical confrontation, emphasizing that in a world of lies, words are more explosive than weapons. Critics hailed this moment as the emotional climax, where the film's satire crystallizes into urgency. It is no longer just about surviving the coup, but about reclaiming the story from those who would rewrite it. Audiences, too, resonated with this event, many praising the way it reframed the action genre around the power of truth. The wounded soldier in the aftermath, stumbling through smoke with the journalist dragging him forward, has been analyzed as the story's emotional resolution. Critics noted how it subverts the traditional triumphant ending. There is no clean victory, no clear restoration of order. Instead, the survivors are scarred, exhausted, but unbroken. This ambiguity speaks to the film's larger resonance, that truth does not erase corruption overnight, that survival is not victory, but that defiance itself is meaningful. The reception of this ending was mixed. Some audiences desired clearer closure, while others admired the refusal to simplify. Scholars praised it as a more honest reflection of political struggle, where wins are partial and victories incomplete. Thematically, the film resonates most strongly in its exploration of Absurdity, by weaving humor into violence, it forces audiences to confront the ridiculousness of systems of power. Critics compared its tone to works of dark satire, noting how the laughter it evokes is uneasy, born not from joy but from recognition. The absurd helicopter stunts, the stubborn jeep that refuses to flip, the sarcastic banter in the middle of gunfights, all serve to remind us that war and politics often collapse into farce. The absurdity is not distraction but critique, a mirror reflecting the ridiculousness of the real world. Emotionally, the bond between soldier and journalist serves as the story's anchor. Critics of character studies emphasized how their dynamic evolves from antagonism to mutual recognition, creating a resonance that outshines the spectacle. Their connection embodies the film's central message. That in chaos, what matters is not victory but humanity. The soldier's rediscovery of purpose and the journalist's realization of the cost of truth form twin arcs that critics praised as surprisingly profound for a film packaged as action comedy. It is this emotional core, they argue, that elevates the narrative beyond genre conventions. Reception-wise, the film sparked debates precisely because of its contradictions. Some critics dismissed it as uneven, struggling to balance satire and action. Others hailed it as daring, a rare attempt to infuse humor into a genre often too self-serious. Audiences, too, split. Some craving straightforward thrills felt disoriented by the tonal shifts, while others found in its absurdity a refreshing honesty. The film's impact lay not in universal acclaim, but in the conversations it provoked, forcing viewers to question what they expect from action cinema and what truths lurk beneath the spectacle. From a critical perspective, the significance of its events lies in how they intertwine spectacle and meaning. The coup is not just chaos, it is commentary on fragile illusions of order. The jungle chase is not just survival. It is confrontation with unpredictability. The betrayals are not just twists, they are reflections of systemic corruption. The climax is not just action, it is a battle for narrative itself, and the resolution is not just survival. It is defiance in the face of futility. Each event builds toward a larger resonance, that truth and humanity, though fragile, endure even in absurdity. The emotional weight of the film lingers precisely because it refuses to offer easy answers. It does not promise that truth triumphs fully, or that corruption collapses neatly. Instead, it shows survival as messy, truth as dangerous, and meaning as something carved out in fleeting moments of connection. Critics argue this refusal to resolve neatly is its greatest strength. It mirrors reality, where victories are partial, where humor coexists with despair, and where humanity endures not because systems allow it, but because individuals insist on it. Ultimately, the film's critical power lies in its contradictions. It is absurd and serious, violent and funny, cynical and hopeful. Its events, when read closely, form a mosaic of commentary on power, corruption, truth, and survival. And in that mosaic lies its lasting resonance, not as a flawless work, but as one that dares to be messy, to be strange, to laugh in the face of violence, and to insist, stubbornly, that even in chaos, there is room for humanity. The making of a film is often imagined as a tightly orchestrated ballet, directors calling the shots with authority, actors sinking into character with discipline, cameras gliding seamlessly to capture it all. But in reality, the process is far stranger, messier, and filled with accidents that somehow sculpt themselves into art. The production of this particular story was no exception. What emerged on screen as a blend of action, comedy, and satire was, behind the camera, the product of improvisation, stubborn determination, and more than a few odd strokes of fate. To explore the production is to realize that the movie's chaotic energy was not just a choice, it was born out of the very chaos of its creation. The first major insight lies in the choice of location. While the film's script called for a volatile nation brimming with unrest, complete with dense jungles and sprawling cityscapes teetering on collapse, the team had to find a setting that could convincingly stand in for such a world. The Dominican Republic was chosen, not simply for its striking landscapes, but for the flexibility it offered in accommodating a large-scale Hollywood production. Yet filming there came with its own quirks. The weather was unpredictable, with sudden downpours halting entire sequences. Crews would spend hours preparing explosions or chase scenes, only to watch rain wash away the setup minutes before shooting. One producer joked that the jungle had final cut privileges, since it dictated when and how scenes could be filmed. But these weather-induced delays had an unexpected gift. They forced the actors and crew into long hours of waiting together, sparking improvisational brainstorming sessions that birthed some of the movie's funniest and most human moments. The director himself was fascinated by contradiction. Known for straightforward, muscular action films in the past, he found himself increasingly drawn to the absurdity of pairing violence with humor. On set, he was notorious for reminding everyone that chaos is comedy if you survive it. This ethos permeated the entire production. Extras were encouraged to fumble their weapons, props were deliberately designed to malfunction in ways that could appear funny, and actors were asked to keep rolling even when things went wrong. This approach blurred the line between accident and intention so thoroughly that sometimes the cast didn't know whether a mistake would end up in the final cut until they saw it in theaters. The lead actor brought his own eccentric energy to the process. With decades of action stardom behind him, he was accustomed to scripts that demanded stoicism and intensity. Here he was asked to play weariness and humor, to undercut the seriousness of the very genre that had defined his career. At first he struggled. Cast and crew members recall how, during the first week, he would deliver his lines with the sharpness of a classic hero, only for the director to stop him and say, "Less legend, more exhaustion." It was in those moments of recalibration that the performance audiences now praise as his most self-aware began to take shape. He later admitted in interviews that much of his sarcastic banter came from sheer frustration on set, days that went too long, props that refused to cooperate, and jungle conditions that wore him down. What could have been an obstacle became fuel for authenticity. The journalist character's portrayal also carries behind-the-scenes richness. The actress cast in the role was committed to bringing depth to what could easily have been a cliché. She shadowed real journalists in volatile regions, observing their mannerisms and rituals. But on set, her biggest challenge wasn't performance, it was staying dry. Filming in the Dominican Republic's humidity meant her wardrobe and equipment constantly soaked through. Crew members joked that she had the hardest role in the film, keeping notebooks from melting. This led to improvisations where the actress would incorporate ruined notes or malfunctioning recorders into her performance, leaning into the frustration. Viewers later praised these moments as authentic character details, not realizing they were born from production headaches. One of the most infamous anecdotes from the shoot involves a Jeep that stubbornly refused to cooperate during a staged explosion. The scene was designed for the vehicle to flip dramatically, serving as a centerpiece in one of the film's chase sequences. Yet no matter how the special effects team rigged it, the Jeep remained upright, merely belching smoke. Frustrated, the director shouted for cameras to keep rolling. The actors improvised their way through the botched stunt, mocking the Jeep's resilience on the spot. What might have been a disaster became a comedic highlight, later hailed as a satirical jab at action tropes. In truth, it was simply the stubbornness of physics refusing to follow the script. Animals added their own unpredictable flair to the production. Shooting in the jungle meant constant interruptions from the natural world. Birds squawked during emotional takes, monkeys snatched food from crew members, and one day, a snake slithered onto the set and into an actor's boot. The scream that followed echoed so loudly that sound engineers thought a bomb had gone off. Rather than scrubbing these encounters from memory, the director embraced them, insisting that the unpredictability of nature mirrored the themes of the film itself. In fact, one sequence of birds scattering mid-scene was entirely unplanned, yet so visually striking it was kept in the final cut. Improvisation extended beyond accidents. The script was written with a tight structure, but once filming began, the director encouraged the cast to bend it, sometimes tossing entire pages aside in favor of spontaneous dialogue. The lead actor, initially hesitant, grew into this freedom, throwing out quips that landed in the finished product. One line about bullets having the worst aim in history was born from a day when blanks repeatedly misfired, leaving actors ducking in unintended directions. By the end of filming, nearly a third of the dialogue had been improvised, a fact that baffled the studio but delighted audiences who sensed the raw, chaotic energy. The crew themselves carried as much character as those in front of the camera. Stories circulated of stunt coordinators racing to adjust choreography mid-scene because weather or equipment refused to cooperate. In one harrowing instance, a carefully rigged bridge collapse nearly failed, leaving actors scrambling to safety as wooden planks snapped out of sequence. Though terrifying in the moment, the footage captured the authentic panic, and the director insisted it was too real to discard. The stunt team later joked that they deserved equal billing with the actors, given how often their near disasters made the final cut. Sound design also carries hidden quirks. Because the filming environment was so noisy, filled with birds, insects, and the constant hum of jungle life, many lines had to be re-recorded in post-production. Yet in doing so, the sound engineers stumbled into a creative decision, layering snippets of ambient jungle noise beneath scenes to give the impression that nature itself was eavesdropping. This subtle touch deepened the film's surreal tone, even though it originated as a solution to bad audio. Even the soundtrack has unusual origins. Budget limitations forced the composer to experiment with eclectic instruments rather than a sweeping orchestral score. He mixed traditional percussion with carnival-like rhythms, creating dissonance that critics later praised as genius satire. In truth, it was the product of necessity. At one point, the composer used steel pans and repurposed plastic drums recorded in the Dominican Republic because the production couldn't afford studio time for a full orchestra. These unconventional sounds became central to the film's offbeat tone, proof that constraint can often breed innovation. Behind the camera, relationships among the cast added their own strange rhythm to the production. The lead actor and actress shared a chemistry on screen that was fueled by playful antagonism off-screen. They frequently teased each other, challenging one another to improvise unexpected lines during takes. More than once, scenes had to be reshot because one had succeeded in making the other laugh uncontrollably. This rivalry turned camaraderie, infused their performances with spontaneity, visible in the way their banter flows with such natural ease. Crew members described them as two kids daring each other to break, a dynamic that carried over into the film's tone. Editing brought its own surprises. Early cuts of the film leaned heavily on the action sequences, but test audiences responded most to the absurd humor, the malfunctioning Jeep, the sarcastic one-liners, the fumbling soldiers. Editors were forced to restructure the pacing, trimming back some of the spectacle to highlight comedic beats. What began as an action-heavy project evolved in post-production into the comedy-thriller hybrid audiences ultimately saw. It was not the original plan, but the alchemy of accident and audience feedback reshaped the entire film. Prop work became another arena of strange improvisations. At one point, a shipment of prop weapons was delayed, forcing the crew to cobble together stand-ins from local hardware stores. An eagle-eyed fan later noticed that one mercenary appeared to be holding what was essentially a spray-painted nail gun. Online debates exploded over whether this was deliberate satire or a continuity error. The truth, of course, is that it was neither. It was necessity. But the fact that fans read it as deliberate shows how seamlessly production accidents aligned with the film's satirical tone. The most whispered-about moment in production lore came near the end of filming. Dissatisfied with the planned conclusion, the director reportedly rewrote the climax on set just hours before shooting. The script supervisor scrambled to keep track. The actors were handed pages they barely had time to memorize, and the crew worked through the night to stage entirely new sequences. Out of this chaos emerged the frantic, unpredictable energy of the finale, an ending that feels improvised because, in many ways, it was. Audiences later praised its raw urgency, never knowing they were watching the product of sleep-deprived invention. Fun facts pepper the production's history like hidden treasures. One stuntman became something of a legend for surviving 3 separate accidents during filming: a mistimed explosion, a collapsing set, and a near miss with a runaway Jeep. He laughed them off, earning the nickname, the Unkillable Extra. Another crew member secretly filmed behind-the-scenes bloopers of cast and crew tripping, fumbling, and joking, later gifting the reel to the team as a wrap present. These unpolished moments revealed a production that, for all its challenges, thrived on camaraderie and humor. Even the marketing carried peculiar touches. The studio leaned into the film's tonal absurdity by releasing posters that exaggerated the seriousness of the leads, only for trailers to reveal slapstick moments. This contradiction puzzled audiences at first, but ultimately became part of the film's identity, a work that refused to fit neatly into any genre box. Looking at it critically, what emerges from these insights is a picture of a production that mirrored the very themes of the story it told. Just as the characters navigated chaos, betrayal, and absurdity, the cast and crew stumbled through weather, accidents, malfunctioning props, and last-minute rewrites. The film's humor, often praised as sharp satire, was born less from grand design than from the willingness to embrace imperfection. The accidents were not obstacles, they were the heartbeat of the project. The fun facts and behind-the-scenes anecdotes reveal that what audiences laughed at and resonated with on screen were often reflections of real struggles off-screen. The malfunctioning Jeep wasn't a gag, but stubborn physics. The sarcastic banter wasn't always scripted, but actors breaking under exhaustion. The jungle's unpredictability wasn't designed, but lived. And yet from all this, a film emerged that felt alive in ways polished productions often don't. In the end, the filmmaking process of this story is a reminder of cinema's strange alchemy. It is never simply what is written on the page or planned in a storyboard. It is weather and accidents, improvisation and laughter, stubborn props and improvised dialogue. It is the collective willingness of a cast and crew to stumble into absurdity and trust that something authentic will emerge. And for this film, what emerged was not just an action comedy, but a strange, satirical reflection of life's chaos, crafted not in spite of production's unpredictability, but because of it. The first impression of a story is often shaped not by the words spoken by its characters, but by the world that surrounds them. In cinema, setting is never neutral. It is the silent narrator that frames every movement, the invisible hand that presses mood into the bloodstream of the story. In this particular film, the settings breathe with as much life as the characters themselves. They shift from the neat sterility of suburban life to the volatile thrum of a nation on the brink, and finally into the humid claustrophobia of the jungle. These transitions are not mere backdrops. They are visual metaphors, cinematic currents that carry the audience deeper into the heart of chaos and revelation. We begin in a space that feels deliberately ordinary. The suburban streets and cookie-cutter houses are painted in muted tones, the cinematography emphasizing flatness, routine, and absence of vibrancy. The camera lingers on mundane details, coffee pouring into a mug, blinds opening to let in pale light, lawns trimmed into uniform precision. These choices seem simple at first glance, but from a critical perspective, they serve as visual shorthand for stagnation. The soldier, once built for danger, is framed here against the sterility of safety, and the setting itself mocks him. The cinematography reinforces this dissonance. Static shots, wide frames that dwarf him in spaces too small for his presence, a palette drained of color. Even before the narrative kicks into gear, the audience is already made to feel the suffocating emptiness of a life stripped of danger. This stark order collapses the moment the narrative shifts to foreign soil. The transition is jarring by design. Where suburban streets felt sterile, the arrival in a small, politically unstable country is marked by vibrancy and unease. The camera no longer lingers statically, but moves with restlessness, tracking through crowded streets bursting with noise, color, and tension. Murals of political leaders plaster walls like declarations of loyalty, soldiers patrol with rifles slung casually yet menacingly, and vendors hawk goods amidst whispered conversations of unrest. The setting is alive, but the cinematography ensures the audience never forgets that beneath this life pulses instability. Handheld shots dominate, giving the impression that the camera itself is unsure of safety, mirroring the protagonist's suspicion. The palette warms with golds and deep shadows, creating a sense of beauty that feels constantly edged by menace. Inside the presidential palace, a different aesthetic takes hold. This setting is constructed to be an illusion of control, a gilded cage where power is projected through architecture. Marble floors gleam under chandeliers, halls echo with grandeur, and the president himself sits framed like a monarch. Yet the cinematography betrays the fragility of this image. The camera angles tilt subtly, never quite level, giving the sense that the world is slightly off balance. The lighting is too polished, bordering on artificial, casting reflections that make the opulence feel suffocating rather than impressive. The palace, in critical terms, is not a symbol of strength but of overcompensation. When the coup erupts, its destruction feels inevitable. The setting itself has been telegraphing fragility from the first moment. The eruption of chaos is rendered not only through performance and action, but through the manipulation of space. As gunfire rattles through the palace, the camera abandons its earlier stillness, shifting into frantic handheld movements, stumbling alongside the characters as if it, too, is caught in the confusion. Hallways that once seemed expansive become claustrophobic as smoke fills the air, turning grandeur into a labyrinth of danger. The lighting fractures, plunging some spaces into shadow while leaving others too bright, blinding rather than illuminating. This cinematic choice emphasizes disorientation. The audience is not just watching chaos but trapped within it. Once the protagonists flee into the jungle, the setting transforms yet again, and here lies the most potent use of environment as metaphor. The jungle is vast, lush, and suffocating, alive with sounds that are as threatening as they are beautiful. Cinematography embraces its unpredictability. Long tracking shots through dense foliage emphasize the endlessness of their struggle, while extreme close-ups highlight the sweat, mud, and exhaustion that press upon them. The jungle is no longer backdrop but antagonist, a character in its own right. At night, the lighting drops into inky darkness, broken only by flickers of firelight or the sharp glare of searchlights cutting through the canopy. The effect is one of constant paranoia. The audience cannot see beyond what the characters see, sharing in their vulnerability. The jungle also plays host to some of the film's most absurd tonal juxtapositions. Amidst its natural danger, humor bubbles up, and the cinematography leans into this tonal dissonance. A wide shot might capture soldiers stumbling through mud while a monkey darts across the frame, mocking their seriousness. A misplaced zoom during a firefight highlights not the bullet exchange, but the frustration on the protagonist's face. These choices are deliberate, using the setting's uncontrollable vitality to underscore the absurdity of the conflict. Critics later noted that this blending of menace and comedy made the jungle sequences feel surreal, almost dreamlike, as if the characters were caught in a fever where danger and farce shared the same breath. Sound design is equally critical in amplifying the atmosphere of each setting. In the suburbs, the soundscape is muted, cars hum distantly, conversations murmur without urgency, silence dominates. In the city, the audio is layered, crowded with overlapping noises that compete for attention, market chatter, political chants, honking vehicles. The palace echoes, every footstep magnified, every gunshot reverberating against marble. And in the jungle, sound becomes omnipresent. The buzz of insects, the rustle of leaves, the distant roar of animals, all conspire to remind the audience that the characters are never alone, never safe. This layering of sound is not incidental, but central to how the settings carve mood into the narrative. Cinematography throughout the film also plays with contrasts in color and light to mirror thematic shifts. The suburbs are pale, desaturated, drained of vitality. The city bursts with golds, reds, and deep shadows, vivid but dangerous. The palace glitters unnaturally, overexposed in its attempt to project power. The jungle, in turn, embraces saturation. The greens are too green, the shadows too deep, the sunlight too blinding. These exaggerations transform the environments into psychological landscapes, externalizing the inner tensions of the story. The soldier's emptiness, the president's fragility, the chaos of the coup, the unpredictability of survival, all are etched into the visual palette. Camera movement, too, functions as a narrative device. In the opening, static frames trap the protagonist, underscoring stagnation. During the coup, the camera whirls and stumbles, thrusting the audience into chaos. In the jungle, long takes drag out tension, mirroring exhaustion. In the climax, the camera cuts erratically, as if even the film itself is scrambling to keep up with the unpredictability of events. These shifts mirror the characters' states of being, ensuring the audience does not simply observe, but experiences the instability. Lighting plays perhaps the most symbolic role of all. Daylight is rarely comforting. In the suburbs, it washes everything flat, highlighting emptiness. In the city, it reveals too much, exposing corruption and unrest. In the jungle, daylight is oppressive, casting harsh shadows that conceal as much as they reveal. Night, meanwhile, offers both danger and intimacy. Fireside conversations glow with vulnerability, even as darkness hides lurking threats. The climax uses lighting as metaphor, bathing the final broadcast in a harsh glare that strips away illusion, emphasizing that truth, though painful, cannot be hidden. One of the most fascinating elements is the way the film uses setting transitions to mirror psychological arcs. The soldier's journey from suburban emptiness, through urban chaos, into the jungle, and back into the capital mirrors his internal struggle from stagnation to confrontation to rediscovery. The journalist's journey is equally reflected. The transition from controlled interviews in gilded halls to raw survival in unforgiving wilderness mirrors her growth from observer to participant. The settings do not just house the story. They sculpt its emotional rhythms. Even production anecdotes reinforce how the settings became characters. The Jeep that refused to flip during a chase was more than a prop mishap. It visually echoed the absurdity of the conflict, a metaphor for the stubborn resilience of the world itself. The helicopter sequences, limited by a cautious pilot, forced the crew to shoot from awkward angles that inadvertently highlighted disorientation. These accidents infused authenticity into the cinematography, blurring intention and improvisation. What critics praised as tonal daring was, in truth, as much the product of environmental resistance as of design. Critically, the settings were central to the film's reception. Some audiences found the tonal whiplash, from suburban malaise to palace opulence to jungle absurdity, disorienting, while others celebrated it as bold experimentation. Scholars analyzing the film's structure noted how the use of space mirrored satirical traditions, from political theater to absurdist literature. The palace collapse was read as commentary on fragile regimes, the jungle as metaphor for uncontrollable chaos, the final return to the capital as a confrontation with the machinery of narrative itself. The film's atmosphere, then, was not incidental. It was built through meticulous use of setting, cinematography, sound, and lighting, each choice reinforcing the story's themes of absurdity, survival, and truth. The suburbs mocked the protagonist's emptiness. The palace mocked power's fragility. The jungle mocked human arrogance in the face of nature. The Capitol mocked the idea of control over narrative. And through these layers, the story achieved its resonance, not as a straightforward action tale, but as a satire wrapped in chaos, a mirror held up to the absurdity of human systems. In the end, the settings and cinematic elements were not mere scaffolding. They were the very bones of the film's identity. They shaped not just what we saw, but how we felt, pressing unease, laughter, fear, and reflection into every frame. They reminded us that stories are not told by characters alone, but by the worlds they inhabit, and that sometimes, the strangest truths emerge not from words, but from the spaces where those words echo. Behind every film lies a hidden story, one not told on screen but whispered in the hours between takes, in the sweat of long days, and in the laughter that keeps exhaustion at bay.